presenters.
Thank you, April. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on program evaluation, sharing institutional best practices, tips, and resources. My name is Maureen Pelham. I'm the Director of the Office of Research and Economic Development at FIU. Presenting with me today are Dr. Bonnie Swan, who is the Director of the Program Evaluation and Education Research Group, PEER, at the University of Central Florida's College of Community Innovation and Education, and Melanie Bauer, who oversees the grant writing lab at Nova Southeastern University. This is an outline of what we plan to do. After Bonnie speaks, and again, after Melanie speaks, we will take time for questions and answers. So please put anything that you'd like to ask any of us into the chat room, and we'll get to those after Bonnie's talk and again after Melanie's. And then if we have time, we're going to try to do a Jamboard reflection. So we will begin with just a Zoom poll of everyone answering the question, what is your experience and your comfort level with supporting faculty in planning their evaluation pieces of their grant applications? So if you could just respond, and that will give us some sense before we get going. Oh, so most 36% have no experience, and 27% have some comfort, 27% some experience, and 9% have no comfort. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for responding. We can go to the next slide, please, April. I'm going to speak first, and I have no slides because I have the least to contribute to this conversation. At FIU, we do not have someone like Melanie, who's super talented, who can write at the institutional level, who's writing evaluation pieces for people. Nor do we have at any of our colleges, even the largest, have an operation, a service center with the scope of services that Bonnie's group offers. And hers includes faculty, her team includes faculty, graduate students, and interns. Some of our research centers, our most well-funded research centers, they almost all have evaluators on faculty or on staff. And these are people who have credentials and CVs that they can be included in grant applications that are funded that way. When anyone else comes to us and asks for evaluation, that they need a sophisticated evaluation plan, at FIU, we direct them to seek outside consultants. So it may be, for example, someone in the field who is well-known or is well-established as an evaluator, or as someone, a biostatistician, or say a quantitative psychologist doing evaluation for a mental health clinical trial. Or we direct them to companies such as WestEd. Many of you may be familiar with them. They do a lot of work with our STEM investigators here, or to individuals. So for example, Bonnie is actually the evaluator on probably one of the most prestigious grants that we have in our College of Engineering's portfolio. So we do not do any evaluation at the institutional level. We don't offer it. Some of our colleges have a few people, some of our centers, well-funded centers, but for the most part, we direct people outside the institution with the thinking, it's not so much cost saving, it's that we just don't have we realize how important evaluation is to many grant applications, and having a really good evaluator is very important. So I'll let Bonnie begin now with her conversation about what they do at UCF.
Thank you. I guess you can hear me okay? I'll assume that you can.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. It's always good to check. This technology is crazy with all of us. And actually, I just heard FIU got another grant that I'm evaluating. They're a really large university. UCF is obviously a large university. It's crazy in Florida. I think we got the largest colleges and universities in the country. One time I heard Valencia was even bigger than UCF. So I was like, we're just huge. So I'm sure even if you have someone on campus that's really good with program evaluation, sometimes just finding them when somebody's trying to submit a grant at the last minute might be tough. So I'm going to go ahead move on here. Thank you all for coming. For the presentation, I'm just going to give you like a quick overview about program evaluation and educational research, which I'll use the acronym PEER, and our role in assisting UCF faculty and those from other organizations in the evaluation process. I'll share a little bit about the projects that we're involved with and also tell you a little bit about our approach and a little bit of some misconceptions sometimes that I hear about. And had I taken that poll, I would have definitely chosen very comfortable. So I would have been that one person that picked that. I have been at PEER for a long time, since 2006, serving as the director. Evaluation is a pretty new field, and most of us are have expertise in methodology, so research methodology, and most of the programs I evaluate are educational programs, so I also have a background in education, so that helps, but not all programs are educational. So for the most part, I think my approach is someone will contact me and say, I'm submitting a grant tomorrow, can you give me a letter? And I'm like, wait, whoa, we need to talk. So I'll tell you what to do when people contact you like that. Go ahead to the next slide. PEER was established in 2003, and we do operate as a service center. We're housed in the College of Community Innovation and Education. And the service center, we started as a service center in 2009 when it became clear it was better just to operate that way. Our staff, like Maureen mentioned, is made up of faculty, research assistants, college interns, and content experts. And depending on the number of contracts we have, and we juggle a lot, that makeup will shift. Last year, I worked on maybe 23 or 25 unique projects. I was trying to count. And I involve 5 faculty members. Right now, I have like 8 faculty members that I'm working with. And 8 graduate research assistants. So most of the projects that we work on are funded by the National Science Foundation. We also have other projects, the U.S. Department of Education, the CDC. We serve as an evaluator for the state of Florida Department of Education, the Department of Health, Department of Corrections I've done work with. Everybody needs an evaluator, seems like, that has a grant that requires it, of course. And as you might imagine, with all these different sponsors and projects, I can't be an expert at everything, which is why we bring in staff, different types of staff to help. Go ahead. Our mission is just basically to provide a good service for providing high quality evaluations, and we do some educational research services related to evaluation to our community agency programs and other sponsored efforts. Most of our work is at UCF, but we also serve as an evaluator, like I said, for the state and some other Florida colleges, community colleges, and a little bit of nonprofit, but not very much. There is another evaluator at UCF that does a lot of nonprofit work. Go ahead. And so you might ask, why do we do evaluation? Well, our country has very limited money and resources to solve all of our problems, and most of the programs that are funded by the federal government come through, with our taxpayers' money. And so everything has a real strong emphasis on evaluation and accountability. I like to think of us evaluators as a guide on the side, or like a critical friend. And we help document basically how a project works from a third-party perspective. And then we provide useful feedback for helping that improve. And then, of course, we judge how well the project's on track for meeting its goals. A lot of what I do as an evaluator is write reports. So typically most of the cost of evaluation is people and paper. Well, we don't even use paper anymore, so it's mostly people, mostly all effort. The reports that we write go to the principal investigator, who in turn does with them what they please. Most often they'll share those with the sponsor if that's required, or Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And then share that information with other stakeholders. Sometimes I'll help with presentations and about that. Often evaluation is required as a condition of receiving grant funding. I like to think we provide a vital service to clients because they a lot of times must have an independent evaluator as a component of getting that money for their grants. And so far, just to let you know the scope of this, we've been involved with over 60 million in educational programs funded through Florida, I'd say maybe in the last decade. So we do keep really busy. I would not say that all of our efforts are necessary from maybe our client's perspective, but they are often necessary from the sponsor's perspective. So we try to make sure everything we do feels like it's useful for our clients. We sort of balance between helping a project, making sure that it's being carried out as planned, or if it's being done differently, maybe why it's being done differently. Maybe we do like a fidelity study for that. And then we look at maybe the outcomes, how well those project goals are met, and providing recommendations for how to improve. We like to have a very clear plan on how we will measure how well those accomplishments are being met for each objective. So we'll have metrics for that we've agreed to with the client. And sometimes that's even in the proposal that's written to at the beginning stages. So there's you have to do a lot of planning way up front. So just to talk a little bit about some common misconceptions, or just some terms that you'll hear thrown around a lot in evaluation. And I'd like to start with internal versus external evaluation. So suppose you're being approached with a project manager for a new program, or someone that's though they have a program where they're developing a proposal for one, and you notice, or they notice, that there's a requirement for evaluation. So there's some basic questions that you need to ask, but the first thing I would check is just to be sure they understand the evaluation requirements for the program and for the sponsor. Sometimes those are up on the program website. Sometimes there's a movie or a webinar they should watch. But often it might be hard to figure out, should it be an internal evaluator or an external evaluator, or does it matter? And the third party evaluator basically means it needs to be someone outside of your institution, like out there. Like with FIU, we would be a third party evaluator for them. And then we have this yellow dot, which is a little bit different, and that's an external evaluator. So that sounds like it's sort of out there, external. They are very similar to the third-party evaluator in that they're not members of the project team. They're both independent enough where they can be very objective and not a lot of bias, or very little bias, or as little bias as possible. In other words, they are the principal investigator for the evaluation. They have their own budget for doing the evaluation, even though they're buried in the principal investigator or the project's budget. They pretty much have their own instruments and their own IRB process and whatnot that they follow for doing the work that they have to do, which often includes like interviews, focus groups, surveys, that kind of thing. You can also have an external evaluator from a different department within the same organization if the walls are high enough. You know, if a third party is not required, then your project manager or grant writer might be able to find someone within your institution. But you need to really read the proposal guidelines very carefully. For example, with the National Science Foundation, I've seen them flip back and forth on defining what is a external evaluator. I think in the last version, they defined that as a third party, and then the most recent version that disappeared. So they sort of have flipped. I always recommend my clients call the program officer if they're not sure what's needed, and because they need to, and you need to, if you're helping them with the proposal, make sure that that you make the right choice. Then there's a combination of both, which is that green arrow. or you can have an internal evaluator who's in your organization. The combination of both internal and external might be great. Some really large grants might need that, but a lot of times that's too expensive. So usually just one or the other is what I see. And then I have this chart here, which you can keep a copy of this. And this is if it's not real clear from the, if you're not responding to an RFP or something, or if it's just not clear, you can always look at this to decide, you know, how can I make the best choice? These are sort of the pros and cons. External there / could be external independent. So, for example, let's see, for credibility, an external independent evaluator might be perceived as being more reliable from those outside the program. Internal evaluators might be seen as less objective or biased because they're closely connected. They're actually getting paid by the project. So they may want to say, oh, everything's going great, you know, but a lot of times they can be objective as well. An issue that an independent or third party, I guess a third party would be more expensive often. And then another drawback of having an external evaluator is that they'll be gone once your project's over. So they won't be around to help you if you're trying to look at long-term impact after a project ends or some like longitudinal study. And there's some other ideas there that you could pick from. Another thing that I often see mixed up is research and evaluation. If you looked at a Venn diagram, it would look like this, sort of like an overlap. So evaluation and research have some overlap, but different ways of differentiating evaluation from research are here. One difference is the purpose. The purpose of research is typically to explore and establish some causal relationships, whereas we evaluators, we just want to describe the program and virtually, you know, like figure out, does it work, and determine whether or not those goals were met. For research, the results are often published at the end of a study to prove or disprove something, and often that'll be like published in a journal article. For evaluation, we start reporting right away during your project because we're trying to drive improvement. So a lot of times I'll do reports multiple times per year. I call those formative reports. Another difference is who we share our results with. For research, the primary audience is the scientific or academic community. For evaluation, it's the project staff and the stakeholders. I don't typically have enough time to write a journal article unless I'm being paid for that. Usually I'm just writing reports for the stakeholders. For evaluation, we'll sometimes do an impact study or do some research. I like to think of all qualitative like surveys as research, but really it's more about the purpose for differentiating. But I might look at impact and do like a causal experimental design for determining whether or not, you know, people learn or people get jobs based on a program. So we will also do research if it's needed. And next I'll switch over to the evaluation approach. Here we'll look a little bit about costs because people say, well, how much do you charge? And I was like, well, how much is enough? You know, what do we need to do? And then, you know, like I'll get an email and it'll say, hi, Bonnie, I'm submitting to the Department of Education doing an OELA project and I need an evaluator. Would you be interested in working with me? And then right away they'll say, like, what does it cost? Can you send me a budget narrative? And I'm like, well, what are you doing? You know, what kind of work, to figure out like what kind of work do I need to do before I can actually write an evaluation plan or come up with a budget for that. I need to really understand how the project's going to work. If I'm not already familiar with the solicitation with determining the budget, I'll go and look at other projects that are funded and try to gauge how rigorous the evaluation is. Sometimes it'll say right in the solicitation, we need a rigorous evaluation. When I talk about rigor, they mean more effort, usually means more expensive, but sometimes just an outcome study is needed, which doesn't really cost a lot and it may only need to be paid at the end of a project. So it really varies and you really need someone with some expertise, maybe from a grant office, or you might even ask the program officer, typically what do you expect? A budget could be anywhere from 2% of a budget to 10% of a budget. It's typically where I range as far as the cost for an entire proposal. If you think about your entire budget, that's before the indirects charged on your budget. So that might be a way to think about the range. Typically, the services You know, for the more extensive will require a lot of reports and a lot of time. Last year I wrote 70 reports, I counted, or 77, there you go, in 2020 alone. So you can imagine how much time and effort goes into that, because we have to review a lot of things and collect a lot of data to be able to do that. So maybe an average of 3 to 5 reports per project. Or sometimes even as many as 10. So it just depends over a project's life, might be needed. Let's see. So now looking at the approaches, just to show you a little bit about how we fit in. From the left side to the right side of here, this is the project's life. This first slide is about assessing program implementation. So often evaluators will do program implementation, and then they'll do evaluation, and then they'll do outcome evaluation. So for assessing program implementation, we will start at the beginning. On the left side of the chart, we'll start to develop a project where the PI is developing a project plan. At that point, we'll start developing I guess a plan to do the evaluation. There you go. Usually this is in response to a call for proposals, and then that's where we figure out, do you need an external or internal evaluator? And if so, we will sometimes provide that feedback at the and develop the evaluation plan with our client. That's always the best pre-award. So usually what peer, we do that at no cost, but if you have someone on your team or someone at your university, they might be a co-PI with you. They would help you write that plan. So I will always ask the PI to try to draft an evaluation plan, just so I can get an idea of what they expect. Try to keep the amount of time down. Otherwise, I would be writing evaluation plans all day. So we'll do some of that. Having a strong evaluation plan is really important. Sometimes it could be 10% of the points scored for whether or not a grant is funded when they're doing that competitive review. And then later, once the project's funded, we'll conduct this process and implementation evaluation. That's in the middle there. In this, we gather evidence for the project activities that are being carried out. Sample evidence might be feedback from the program staff, like meeting notes, a participant database, content being developed, evidence of dissemination efforts that they have, research outputs that they've generated, and whatever other evidence that we've agreed to. And usually we've agreed to all that evidence up front of what we would like to see for evidence. And then we gather feedback from different groups. So I'll do interviews of the different involved people. Like say if it's an educational program, I might want to talk to the students or the faculty or that kind of thing. And we do surveys and focus groups and things like that. And then we provide little reports back to the project PIs in a way that protects the participants, so nobody knows who said what, to give them some feedback about how it's going, and that way they can improve. And those kind of reports just go to the PI. And then we do these, our research design is generally descriptive. As you imagine, it sounds descriptive. We just sort of describe what's happening. But let me emphasize, this is different for every project. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And that's over to the right with the outcome. And that's at the end of the project's life cycle, or if it's a project that repeats over and over, and most projects do year to year will repeat, we'll conduct these outcome evaluations. And that's how well the project's on track for meeting its goals. So top projects typically span like 1 year to 5 years. So this project, it repeats. And then like, for example, you might bring in a new cohort of students if you're starting a new program each spring, each fall. So typically projects will get better and better as they go along, we like to hope. That basically just looks at, you start looking at your counts for enrollment and that kind of thing, and what your goals are and whether or not you're on track for meeting those goals. Sometimes goals are annual, sometimes they're, at the end. We just look for whether or not you're on track for meeting them. We ask a lot of questions. So some typical questions that you would ask for an outcome study would be, are the objectives being met? Are the students satisfied? What's working well? What can be improved? How effective is the recruitment process? And then what critical components of a project should be sustained or can be sustained across for the next year or past the grant and when the grant ends, because a lot of times the sponsor will want this grant to continue, the work to continue even after the money dries up, right? So we'll ask a lot of questions about that. The research approach for these can be are usually highly participatory, meaning I like to work with the PI closely on getting that information for that. So we'll use a lot of post-type measures or pre-post type measures. Sometimes we'll look at gains in attitude or improvement in attitude or gains in knowledge or things like that. And an impact study, like I mentioned earlier, might be a more rigorous comparison group design or quasi-experiment. And then here's my last slide. Which is a list of who we've served recently. So if you were to have a center like we have at Peer, you can see we serve a lot of different clients. Many of these we're serving right now. And I'm just mentioning the ones that we've had recently. For example, we've had, sometimes it'll be like a consortium of different colleges. Like we had these large TAC grants in Florida where it was like 13 million and there's 6 colleges involved. So that we've evaluated a few of those. So another example that we're teaming with is in the College of Medicine, just to show you the diversity. I'm evaluating the colorectal cancer screening program for the state of Florida, which is sponsored by the CDC. I had known nothing about colorectal cancer screening, but I have hired one of the best researchers anywhere. He's actually our IRB chair, Robin Hines, Dr. Robert Hines. He's the lead on that one, and I work with him. He doesn't know a lot about program evaluation, but he knows a whole lot about cancer and screening, helping clinics improve their screening programs. So we team on that. We evaluate the state's rape prevention education program statewide, looking at human trafficking. I'm working with Dr. Roberto Potter, who's the head of the Human Trafficking Center at UCF, and he's an evaluator as well. So we team with whoever it takes to get the work done. We're also evaluating a program for Orange County Public Schools for promoting adolescent health for HIV and STD prevention. We're evaluating English language learners programs in K-12 schools. And we're evaluating the NASA Miro program at FIU for improving STEM education. And we do a lot with engineering and computer science. So NSF, like RUs, STEM, we do a cyber core scholarship for service project, and we just do a lot of different things, whatever it takes to help our clients. So anyway, if you're looking for an evaluator, if we can't help, I can find someone who can, who better suits your needs. So here's my contact information. And if you ever want to talk about anything, feel free to call me at Peer, and I might be able to point you in the right direction for serving your needs. So thank you. That brings me to the end. Hope I didn't talk too fast. Any questions?
Any questions for Bonnie before we move on to our next presenter? If not, you can type them in the chat. Dr. Swan can be on hand to answer.
Thanks.
All right, well, here I am then, the last in our session. I'm mostly going to be sharing experience from before coming to NSU. I definitely leveraged a lot of that experience to my current position at NSU, but as such, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background before I came here and what I'm doing now, and then some tools, because I really think as an RD person, if you're not already involved in speaking with PIs about evaluation, if they're submitting a program grant and evaluation is a totally new world for them, and even maybe for you, there's an opportunity for us as RD staff to be a bridge, to help them dabble a little bit in evaluation, enough to be able to talk to an evaluator and prepare them, and in some cases even write that evaluation plan. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about what I've done, what I'm doing here, and some tools and how to find some evaluators. Some information was covered by Bonnie as well, so I'll be hitting some similar and also highlighting some additional things. So next slide. So prior to coming here, I did grad school in cognitive psychology, and then where the bulk of my experience in evaluation came from was I was in a STEM education program evaluation and research lab. So we studied mostly undergraduate education. I filled various roles in various grant-funded projects, from evaluator to postdoc, even though I wasn't doing a postdoc, also project management roles, and there are the funding sources that we had on these grants. I also have some publications in evaluation and some others in education research. So this has been an interesting and unexpected part of my past, and I've been able to leverage for research development. So in the current position I have here, I work in a central research department where I do a lot of things that you all do, providing development for individual proposals, but also doing general trainings and among other things. And here are just a smattering of things I've done recently. I mean, I've only been in this position coming up on 2 years, but here are just some ways I've been involved as an RD person with a little bit more maybe evaluation experience than the average RD person, but also ways that I think some of these that you can also sort of do that evaluation, dabble in that evaluation support. So one of the things I've been involved in is a group submitting, actually now resubmitting, an NSF NRT proposal. They have found my support useful not only in thinking about their evaluation section, but when they've been planning and now replanning their activities, because evaluation helps not only with when the thing happens, what are the outcomes, but also the tools, say the logic model that I'll be introducing next, is perfectly placed to help with planning activities. So having that very simple framework that maybe you become a little familiar with, it can really be a very helpful tool at various stages in planning a program. I also, in the middle, feature an EDA proposal that I worked with someone on. In this case, I helped them transform multiple blocks of text into a logic model. So we got to reduce all that text, make it a little more visual. So things that reviewers are familiar with are these logic models. So I helped create and add that organization and bit of visual to this person's proposal. And then I'm happy to, follow on from what we announced for today, in that, being involved in using a logic model for our successful NSF Germination proposal, and then writing that accompanying evaluation section. So you don't have to be as in the weeds as that. I definitely operated more like an evaluator in that respect, really getting more hands-on and providing that leadership and structure and evaluation. You don't have to go that far though. So next slide. What I would recommend, if you'd like to get a little bit, dip your toes into evaluation, is become familiar with this visual. So it's called a logic model. And these are really useful tools that you can help PIs start to fill in to then be able to talk in a little bit more developed way with an evaluator. So if you're not familiar with a logic model, it's basically a logical flow of thoughts that with any program, there are inputs, which are like staff and materials and resources that support the activities that are going to happen. So that's like, I'm going to run some workshops, I'm going to run a course, I'm going to run this intervention. And then outcomes over various periods of time, short, long term. You can throw medium in there. And I link up in the top right-hand corner 2 resources from CDC. And they're really a go-to in this space as far as like, if you want to get started with evaluation or a logic model. And I also link some logic model examples. I do provide an example of a logic model too in this PowerPoint. But what you can help PIs do is fill out these middle 2 blocks. And I tell PIs, if we can work together, or if you can work independently, fill these out. That's when you're ready, when you've drafted, items for these two columns. So that's a nice, getting them in a space where they're comfortable, they're thinking about activities. Okay, they're getting excited about the various components of their program. They have an idea of like their objectives, right? And maybe start speaking their language a little bit as a teacher. What are the objectives you would have for your students? And so what do objectives for your program participants, and say, hey, let's try to start filling these in, and then that's a great time to then reach out to an evaluator, and then they can sort of hopefully help you from there. This is just an example. This is actually the logic model from our NSF germination proposal. So if you're interested too in learning a little bit more about germination, here's a logic model from our proposal. There's various ways to build logic models. I should say, you'll see in these guides some additional columns like outputs. And you can even, again, like I had said before, throw in medium-term outcomes. This is my preference for making a logic model. I find, once you get a lot of columns, you got to really squeeze in very tiny text. So I tend to put some more information below a chart, or sort of omit it if it's not like super important and necessary to the understanding of the program functioning. You can be a little creative with this. So this is my preference for how to structure a logic model. All right, so then you have that logic model, you have those short-term goals and some activities, set up that call with an evaluator. Having an RD person present in that call can be helpful if the PI wants to have your support in that, especially if sort of you help them maybe draft or get it in that logic model format. And it's rarely too early to reach out. Even if they don't have that drafted logic model, you can reach out. I think being a little bit further along in the conversation and in the planning can be helpful and make for a more productive conversation with an evaluator, but it is totally appropriate to interview several evaluators. So say, it's a pretty substantial evaluation component to a program. You want to get a sense of what an evaluator's expertise is, what their personality is like, kind of like when you're interviewing someone for a job. You want to make sure it's the right fit for your team, for your needs, and so on. And sort of relatedly, it's never really too early to talk cost. And if you'll present the next set, there are various things that you might consider. So some RFPs will cap evaluation costs. If they don't cap them, this is a general rule of thumb I've heard sort of batted around. If you're trying to get a sense of how much evaluation you should be budgeting for, which, as Bonnie said, mostly goes to salary, that would be maybe about 5 to 10% of direct costs. Some evaluators have a set rate that they work at. Maybe on an hourly rate, or just like a chunk of money. This is what we usually charge for our services. Check it out. But I've seen hourly rates ranging from 50 to 150 per hour if you want to get a sense of the commitment. For our NSF germination project, I budgeted this, and sort of this is maybe give you an idea of almost like a bare bones kind of a thing. As far as minimally budgeting for evaluation, this is kind of what we did. So it's not atypical to do something like meet quarterly with an external evaluator. So when I was budgeting, that meant 1 hour meetings 4 times a year. And that with each of those meetings, there might be some pre and post work. So then I budgeted 5 hours. And I think I budgeted another 5 hours to have him generate an annual report. That sort of, he was looking back and doing, helping me then with that submission of an annual report. And, they can be as involved as you want, or that they want to be involved. I like to use evaluation, both when I was being an evaluator and now when working with this evaluator, to get, as Bonnie said, their thoughts as like a critical friend. They can, if they want to, again, and you're budgeting and they have the time to do it, you can get their feedback and thoughts on, the study design most basically, but also on the instruments, the items that you're using in like a survey or an interview. They can help you interpret the data, generate action items for your team, based on that formative sort of like feedback that you're getting as you're conducting that project, and generate some action items for your team. So they can be work as closely as you want. Some tend to work sort of more outside and separate from the leadership team and provide that very external objective feedback. And some, my tendency, because I like evaluation so much, is to have them be more involved in the process. But then at the end of the day, of course, being that critical eye. So how might you find an evaluator if you don't have a friend who's an evaluator, though that is totally appropriate? There is a helpful evaluator finder. So the American Evaluation Association is sort of our national professional society. And at this link, you can go to their database, type in and filter by all sorts of things. But you could type in like NSF, for example, or a particular funder, or a particular type of work like STEM education. And then this whole list of people come up and you can click in and it'll give you a profile like this snapshot on the right hand side that like this is their expertise. This happens to be, a larger firm and they have a lot of expertise. I don't know if it all applies to this one individual, but that's a way also to drill more into, okay, I know I need this specific methodology or this specific, or I want someone who has experience with this type of funder or even funding opportunity. See, someone here even lists like the ATE and IU's programs at NSF. So that's a really helpful directory if you are sort of looking and don't know where to refer faculty to. And these tend to be, these tend to be people with PhDs in education, ed psych, cog psych, but also, look within your institution. Your teaching and learning centers sometimes have evaluation people that are willing to help. Institutional research office, again, may or may not be a helpful player in a given evaluation project. And sometimes colleges or departments have people who are tracking things that might be relevant to your evaluation. And that's where Bonnie's visual, where you can have third party, internal, external, or a combination. Likely many projects would benefit from a combination, right? Like people who are already gathering institutional information, people who are gathering some more information, and then all the way up to maybe people helping you conduct your evaluation. So, all right, there, go ahead. So some other sort of additional considerations. Take a look at the RFP. Is this going to be a pretty rigorous evaluation? Something to keep in mind when you're looking for evaluators. In my experience, most of my experience, I should say, is with NSF. NSF, at least in the programs I've been applying to, are more open. I hear they'll have less experience with Department of Ed and CDC, which tend to have really strict evaluation guidelines, and might be some of those ones where, as Bonnie said, they might be scoring you something like 10% of your overall score in the evaluation space. I have found that NSF is sort of okay, and I'll say this on a following slide, with you sort of blurring the lines between evaluation and research. They really are interested, as you're not surprised probably, in research coming out of their projects, and that includes their education programs that they're funding. And so I've found that they really do enjoy when you sort of even structure your evaluation or have as an outcome of your evaluation, advancing education research. So if you can get someone on your team or someone external to your team to help you advance that, I find that's a pro. But then definitely take a look. Do you need a specific method or skill, something complex, something a little more qualitative? Some evaluators have narrow expertise or interest, and some have more general. Keep this in mind when doing your search. And do you need someone who's worked with specific populations? Like getting data from students is maybe different from getting data from faculty and adult professionals. And if they've worked in these other spaces. So that directory was interesting because you can imagine plugging in these types of search terms and finding a good match. And with all of us working a lot, largely remotely anyway, it's pretty seamless to work with an evaluator in any part of the country. All right, so I did just want to mention this because Bonnie had a really great list of those, what's evaluation, what's research, and, where theirs might be separate and where things might be overlapping. This is sort of another way to think about it too, which is how I approach it. I find lines can usually be blurred. Again, my experience is mostly with NSF. I tend to approach it like this. So for me, evaluation is in that logic model. If you remember, there were all of those short-term outcomes listed in a column. And that's what you're reporting on to your funder, right? You're doing formative assessments, you're doing summative assessments, and you're reporting on comprehensively on your short-term outcomes. So then a subset of the data that you're likely collecting could be publishable because you're impacting and influencing people, groups, communities, and so on. So thinking about all of the data you have on the table, is there something publishable there? Do you need to collect a little more data to make that information publishable, or do you have to structure your design a little bit in a little bit of a different, maybe more rigorous, experimentally way to get something publishable out of it. So I usually try to set up, I think this, do I have this as the next bullet? I sort of set up my IRB so that all the evaluation data is fair game for research. So you don't have to worry about consenting people after the fact or figuring that out. And it can be really helpful to have a co-PI on a project, if not a PI, who has that sort of education, psych, or evaluation background. So they can, it's a very attractive thing to do for reviewers and for funders, that you have that expertise, not only in an external person, but someone internal on your team. So consider your colleges of psychology or your faculty that have that education, research, or psychology background. That could really beef up your team. All right, so we have time now to pause for Q&A before we wrap up.
So no question, do you want to jump to the Jamboard?
Sure can. All right, I'll throw the Jamboard in the chat. So if you all want to go join us over there. We have two just reflective questions that we were curious about and maybe could direct future Florida conversations. Feel free to jump between the slides, but the first one is, any aha moments you had during this presentation or any lessons learned. And then the second slide would be, what questions do you still have, or what barriers or obstacles in evaluation do you feel still exist for you to be able to support faculty and or for faculty at your institutions themselves? So if you're not familiar with Jamboard, on the left-hand column over there, you'll see a little sticky note as the fourth icon. If you click it, you can just start typing and click save, and it throws it right there on the Jamboard. So we welcome your input here and thoughts and reflections. Yes, Bonnie, there's the link that I just put in the chat, that Jamboard, that's the link to get to the Jamboard.
And feel free to think about it, write what you need to, even after the presentation. At the end of the day, I'll go ahead and save it and then add it to their presentation so everybody can view it.
Melanie, I was thinking, this is Bonnie, when you were talking, I think a lot of times with the educational programs, it's good to have an educational researcher as a co-PI, and we don't want to necessarily rely on the evaluator to do all of the educational research component. It's stronger to have someone on your team as a co-PI involved with that.
Exactly, yes, great. Yeah, and so, these might be faculty in your College of Education, but I don't know if it's more and more, or I just, when I was working in my prior institution, I was seeing more departments getting disciplinary education researchers. So people who did both like disciplinary biology research, but also were hired in their position to do biology education research too. So sometimes departments in colleges might have people, even if they're not in the College of Education, that could be a co-PI, as Bonnie was saying. yeah, I'll just say sort of, yeah, I hope you find the logic model easy to use and helpful in having those conversations with faculty, because in at least with this one team I'm thinking about in particular, they also just didn't even know what evaluation was. Like, what's even an evaluator going to do as part of this project, and who should I be looking for? So sometimes faculty needed, even at that level, like, what role is evaluation going to play in my project, and what am I looking for in an evaluator? And sometimes it's a colleague that they know, someone who's been promoted to a dean position who now does evaluation for their college. Like, it can be someone like that in some cases, or sometimes you really need an evaluation expert. But I have found that sometimes faculty don't even know where to start, or how that interacts with the project they're pitching. But I think frequently what happens is, faculty, you can refer them to their colleagues. So if you know of someone else who's gotten a program grant that required evaluation, referrals happen all the time. I think that's mostly how people find evaluation. That AEA resource does exist, that directory. I don't know how they get chosen or not to be listed there, but referrals are a great way also. And maybe your office sometimes might be the one who's asked. So maybe start your own little list of people who you might be able to refer faculty to.
For that question, do you need to name the evaluator? Not always. I think it can, I mean, sometimes the evaluator's credentials are really important. In other words, are they part of, are you even allowed to include their vita? If you're able to include their vita, then yeah, their credentials are really important. So it just depends on how they fit in your proposal and whether or not, and whose vita they'll allow you to provide. I like to have my name, with my credentials, I got pretty strong credentials. I would suggest naming the evaluator, but sometimes I'll be approached after projects funded and being asked to be evaluated, to be an evaluator. So it does differ.
Couple more minutes. If anybody has any questions, you can write in the chat. You can unmute.
A little bit semi off topic, but it kind of caused my little brain to go, like you said, it's never too early to talk about the budget, like that's what I'm trying to get just in general, writing a proposal. I always try to get my PIs to write the budget first, because you write the proposal 50 pages for the sun and the moon and the stars and the rainbows and the unicorns, and then you find out you can't have 3 of those things. Then you have to rewrite the entire budget. The scope may change, timeframes may change. So it's like I'm beating home to them, like they have to do the budget first. Let's get that kind of squared away. Then you kind of write the proposal. It's like, I mean, arts and humanities, so arts aren't all that big in general. So I mean, it's doable, but it's hard. I think I'm finally, after a couple years now, trying, like, actually have gotten through to most of them that I deal with, that we work on the budget first, and then you can start working on the other stuff.
Well, thanks everyone for your input, and yeah, feel free to add more to the Jamboard. Thanks.